In the summer of 1944, a small group of German prisoners of war were escorted out of their camp and placed on wooden benches beside a large open field somewhere in the American Midwest, where hundreds of civilians were already gathered, shouting, clapping, and rising from their seats every few minutes while men in strange uniforms ran across the grass chasing a small white ball. And as the noise of the crowd grew louder with every swing of a wooden bat, the prisoners exchanged confused looks with one another because nothing about the scene in front of them resembled a military drill, a parade, or any sport they had ever seen in Europe. Yet the Americans around them seemed to understand exactly what was happening and were cheering as if something extremely important had just occurred. The invitation to leave the camp that afternoon came as a surprise to the small group of prisoners selected for the trip. Normally, movement outside the camp happened only for organized work details on nearby farms or maintenance tasks supervised by guards. This time the instructions were different. The prisoners were told they would accompany a guard unit to a nearby town for several hours before returning in the evening. No explanation was offered beyond that, which naturally created curiosity among the men as they climbed into the back of the military truck waiting near the camp gate. The vehicle rolled slowly through the entrance while the familiar sight of barbed wire fences and wooden watchtowers faded behind them. For most of the prisoners, trips beyond the camp perimeter were rare enough to feel like small events. As the truck moved along the rural road, the soldiers watched the countryside pass by. Wide fields stretched across the landscape, dotted with barns and farmhouses that appeared untouched by war. For men who had spent the last years moving through battle zones in Europe, the calm appearance of the American countryside still felt unusual. After some time, the truck reached the outskirts of a small town. The road gradually filled with civilian traffic, and rows of storefronts appeared along the main street. People moved along the sidewalks carrying groceries or speaking with neighbors, continuing their daily routines without any sign of the destruction that had become common in many parts of Europe during the war. The prisoners sat quietly in the truck while observing the scene, aware that they were being watched with curiosity by some of the townspeople as the vehicle passed. Eventually, the truck turned toward a large open area on the edge of town where several wooden structures surrounded a wide grassy field. Even before the prisoners could see the field clearly, they could hear the sound of a crowd gathered nearby. Voices rose and fell in waves of cheering that carried across the open space, accompanied by occasional bursts of applause that echoed across the stands. The truck stopped near a section of simple wooden seating where people were already filling the rows of benches. The prisoners stepped down under the supervision of the guards and were directed toward a small area reserved for them near the side of the field. From this position, they could finally see what had drawn the crowd together. In the center of the field stood a group of men wearing matching uniforms, each holding unusual equipment that immediately caught the prisoners' attention. One man stood near a small raised mound of dirt, while another waited several meters away holding a long wooden bat over his shoulder. Around them, other players were spread across the grass as if preparing for some kind of coordinated movement. To the German soldiers, the arrangement looked strangely formal. The positions of the players seemed carefully organized, almost like the placement of troops during a training exercise. Yet there were no rifles, no officers giving commands, and no obvious objective that explained why hundreds of civilians had gathered to watch. The first loud crack of the bat only deepened the confusion. The player standing near the mound threw the ball forward with sudden speed, and the man holding the bat swung at it with a motion that sent the ball flying high into the air. Instantly, the crowd erupted into cheers, while several players began running across the field in different directions. The prisoners leaned forward slightly, trying to follow what had just happened. The players seemed to understand the purpose of their movements perfectly, but to the observers sitting on the bench, the sequence of events made little sense. One player ran toward a square bag placed on the ground, while another attempted to catch the ball before it landed. The crowd reacted to each movement with excitement, shouting and clapping as if every moment carried some kind of meaning. For the German soldiers watching from the side of the field, the entire spectacle felt strangely unfamiliar. They had seen many sports in Europe before the war, including football matches that could draw large crowds in major cities. But whatever game was unfolding on this field followed rules that none of them immediately recognized. And as the cheering crowd continued reacting to every swing of the bat, the prisoners quietly realized that they were witnessing something completely new. During the first several minutes of the game, the prisoners remained mostly silent while trying to follow the sequence of events unfolding on the field. The players moved between several fixed points marked by white square bases placed at equal distances across the grass, and each time the bat struck the ball, the entire field suddenly came alive with motion. Some players sprinted toward the bases while others chased the ball across the open space, and the crowd responded instantly with loud reactions that rose and fell like waves across the wooden stands. For the German soldiers watching from their bench, the structure of the game was difficult to understand at first. In European sports such as football, the objective was obvious from the moment the match began. Two teams competed to move a ball into opposing goals, and even someone unfamiliar with the exact rules could quickly understand the purpose of the movements on the field. The game unfolding in front of them, however, appeared to follow a completely different logic. One prisoner leaned slightly forward, narrowing his eyes as he watched a runner dash from one base to another while a defender attempted to catch the ball in midair. Another prisoner whispered quietly to the man beside him, asking whether he could see any kind of pattern in the movements. The answer was uncertain. At first glance, it seemed as if the players were simply running between several points while the crowd reacted enthusiastically to each successful hit. What made the situation even more confusing was the intensity of the spectators. Every time the batter connected with the ball, the audience immediately rose from the benches with loud cheers. Hats were lifted into the air, and people clapped while following the ball's path across the field. Even when the ball landed far from the stands, the crowd seemed to know instantly whether the moment had been successful or disappointing. To the prisoners, the reactions of the crowd were almost as interesting as the game itself. The spectators clearly understood something that the observers did not. Small details in the movement of the players triggered excitement or frustration among the audience. Yet the reasons behind those reactions were not immediately clear to someone unfamiliar with the sport. Gradually, as the innings continued, a few prisoners began noticing small patterns. The batter always stood in the same position when facing the pitcher, and the runner attempted to reach each base before the defenders could return the ball to a specific location. Sometimes the batter dropped the bat and sprinted toward the first base while the fielders scrambled to intercept the ball. Even with these observations, however, the deeper structure of the game remained unclear. Why were there 4 bases instead of 2 goals? Why did the players stop after reaching certain points rather than continuing across the entire field? And most puzzling of all, why did the crowd erupt into celebration when the ball traveled beyond the outer edge of the field? The prisoners exchanged quiet comments with one another while continuing to watch. Some speculated that the game might resemble certain children's sports played in Europe, where players ran between marked points while avoiding being tagged. Others believed the activity might be a form of military training disguised as entertainment, since the coordinated movements of the fielders required quick reactions and teamwork. Meanwhile, the Americans in the stands remained completely absorbed in the game. Vendors moved between the rows selling refreshments. Children leaned forward excitedly with every swing of the bat, and entire sections of the crowd reacted together whenever the home team seemed to gain an advantage. For the prisoners sitting along the side of the field, the scene created a strange feeling of observation from outside an unfamiliar culture. They could see the enthusiasm and understand that something important was happening in the eyes of the spectators, yet the meaning behind the excitement still remained just beyond their understanding. And as the game continued inning after inning, The prisoners realized that the Americans around them were not merely watching a sport. They were participating in a tradition that the prisoners had never encountered before. As the game continued, the prisoners gradually shifted their attention from trying to understand the rules toward observing the behavior of the crowd itself. The spectators seemed deeply invested in every movement on the field, reacting instantly to moments that the prisoners still struggled to interpret. Some people stood up and shouted instructions toward the players, while others laughed, applauded, or groaned depending on the outcome of each play. For the German soldiers, this interaction between the crowd and the players was something they had rarely seen during wartime. Large gatherings of civilians in Europe had become increasingly rare as the conflict intensified, and when people did assemble in public spaces, it was often for serious purposes such as political announcements, military parades, or civil defense activities. The relaxed atmosphere surrounding this sporting event created a sharp contrast with those memories. Families sat together along the wooden benches, sharing food and speaking casually while keeping their eyes fixed on the field. Children leaned over the railings with excitement whenever a player struck the ball into the air, and older spectators discussed the game in animated voices as if analyzing a familiar ritual. Vendors moved through the aisles carrying trays filled with snacks and drinks, offering refreshments to anyone who wanted them. The prisoners watched these scenes with growing curiosity. In many ways, the crowd seemed just as important to the event as the players themselves. Their reactions gave rhythm to the entire afternoon, rising and falling as the game progressed from one inning to the next. Even when the action on the field paused briefly, the spectators remained engaged, talking among themselves about what might happen next. One prisoner quietly remarked that the crowd seemed to understand every detail of the game instinctively. When the batter stepped forward, people leaned slightly toward the field in anticipation. When the pitcher released the ball, hundreds of heads turned in perfect synchronization to follow its path. And when the batter connected with a powerful swing, the entire audience responded with a sudden burst of noise that spread across the stands like a wave. The soldiers began to realize that what they were witnessing was not simply a sport, but a shared cultural experience. The Americans in the stands had likely grown up watching games like this, learning the rules from childhood and associating the event with leisure rather than duty. To them, the field represented a place where competition could exist without the dangers that had defined the war. For the prisoners, this realization created a strange moment of reflection. Only months earlier, many of them had been stationed on battlefields where the sound of cheering crowds would have been unimaginable. Instead of wooden bats striking baseballs, they had heard artillery shells and rifle fire echoing across destroyed towns and muddy fields. Now they were sitting among civilians who gathered simply to watch a game played for enjoyment. One of the guards standing nearby noticed the puzzled expressions on the prisoners' faces and briefly explained a few basic rules of the sport. The batter attempted to hit the ball thrown by the pitcher, then run around the 4 bases before the opposing team could stop him. Each successful run contributed to the team's score, and the game progressed through several innings until one team emerged victorious. The explanation clarified some of the confusion, yet it also revealed how deeply unfamiliar the sport remained to the prisoners. Even with the rules described in simple terms, the speed and complexity of the game made it difficult to follow every moment. Still, the soldiers continued watching with interest, because even if they could not fully understand the game itself, they could clearly see how much it meant to the people surrounding them. As the afternoon moved forward and the game entered its later innings, the prisoners slowly began noticing details that had escaped their attention earlier. Once the basic rules had been explained by one of the guards, the movement of the players across the field started to make slightly more sense. The batter waited for the right moment to swing. The runners attempted to reach the next base before the ball could be returned, and the fielders reacted quickly in an effort to stop the advance. Although the game was still unfamiliar to the German soldiers, they could now follow certain moments more clearly. When the batter connected with a strong hit, several prisoners instinctively leaned forward as the ball traveled high across the field. They watched as a fielder sprinted across the grass in an attempt to intercept it before it landed. When the player managed to catch the ball in midair, the crowd reacted with a mixture of applause and disappointment, depending on which team they supported. For the prisoners, this combination of competition and excitement began to reveal something important about the atmosphere surrounding the event. The Americans watching the game were not gathered for a formal ceremony or a military demonstration. Instead, the entire experience was centered on entertainment and community. People attended the game to relax, enjoy the afternoon, and support their local team. The soldiers sitting along the edge of the field exchanged quiet observations about this realization. In wartime Europe, public gatherings often carried a very different tone. Events organized for large crowds usually involved speeches, official announcements, or displays intended to strengthen morale during difficult periods. The baseball game, however, seemed free from that kind of pressure. The spectators cheered because they wanted to, not because they were expected to. Another detail that caught the prisoners' attention was the relaxed behavior of the guards supervising them. The American soldiers remained alert and attentive to their duties, yet their posture lacked the tension that often characterized military environments near the front. Some of the guards even followed the game with interest while maintaining their watch over the prisoners. This mixture of supervision and casual observation created a strange balance for the prisoners. They were still clearly under guard, and their presence at the game was carefully controlled. Yet at the same time, they had been brought to watch a local sporting event alongside ordinary civilians. The situation was unusual enough that several prisoners quietly wondered whether similar scenes could ever have occurred during the war in Europe. As the game continued, the sound of the crowd rose again when one batter struck the ball far beyond the outer field. The spectators erupted in cheers while the runner moved quickly around the bases. Even without fully understanding the significance of the moment, the prisoners recognized that something impressive had just happened. The excitement of the crowd made it impossible to ignore. Gradually, the confusion that had dominated the early part of the afternoon began to transform into curiosity. The prisoners still lacked the deep familiarity that the American spectators possessed, but they were beginning to see why the game held such importance for the people watching it. By the time the final innings approached, the German soldiers realized that what had once looked like a completely mysterious activity was slowly becoming easier to follow. The rules, the cheering, and the rhythm of the game were no longer entirely foreign. Yet one question still lingered in their minds. Even after spending hours watching the game, they still found it remarkable that so many Americans could gather together simply to celebrate a sport in the middle of a global war. By the time the game moved into its final innings, the atmosphere inside the small stadium had become even more intense. The sun was beginning to drop lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the field while the players continued moving quickly between the bases. The prisoners, who earlier had watched the game with visible confusion, now followed the action with greater attention, slowly recognizing certain moments that seemed to matter more than others. They could now see how the tension in the crowd changed depending on the situation. When a batter stepped forward with two runners already on base, the spectators leaned forward expectantly. When the pitcher threw the ball with sudden speed toward the plate, hundreds of heads turned in perfect synchronization to follow its path. And when the bat connected with a sharp crack that sent the ball racing across the field, the entire crowd reacted almost instantly. Even though the German prisoners still lacked the lifelong familiarity that the American spectators possessed, they had begun to understand the basic structure of the game. A successful hit could change the momentum of the inning, a quick catch could stop a runner, and a well-timed play could shift the energy of the entire stadium. Yet what continued to fascinate the prisoners was not only the sport itself, but the emotional investment of the people watching it. The crowd responded to each moment with genuine excitement. Neighbors clapped each other on the shoulders after a good play. Children shouted encouragement toward the field, and groups of friends argued enthusiastically about the decisions made by the players. For the German soldiers sitting together on the wooden benches, this atmosphere created a strange mixture of curiosity and reflection. Only a short time earlier, they had been living in environments where large gatherings of civilians were overshadowed by the realities of war. Cities had faced air raids, transportation networks had been disrupted, and many public spaces had lost the normal rhythms of everyday life. Here, however, the crowd behaved as if the game itself was the most important event of the afternoon. The players ran across a perfectly maintained field while spectators cheered with complete focus on the contest unfolding before them. At one point, a batter struck the ball deep into the outfield, sending it soaring high above the grass before it landed near the boundary fence. The runner dashed from base to base while the fielders scrambled to retrieve the ball. The moment triggered the loudest reaction of the day, with hundreds of voices rising together in celebration. Even the prisoners could not help reacting slightly as they watched the dramatic play unfold. Although they still felt somewhat like outsiders observing an unfamiliar ritual, the energy of the crowd was difficult to ignore. When the final inning eventually concluded and the players began leaving the field, the spectators slowly gathered their belongings and started moving toward the exits. Conversations continued as people discussed the highlights of the game while walking out of the stadium. The guards signaled to the prisoners that it was time to return to the truck waiting nearby. As the soldiers stood and began walking away from the benches, several of them took one last look across the field where the players had just finished their contest. They had arrived that afternoon expecting to witness something strange and confusing. And although the game had indeed begun that way, by the end of the day they realized that they had also seen something they had not expected. A moment of ordinary life continuing far away from the front lines of the war. As the truck carrying the prisoners pulled away from the small stadium, the sound of the crowd gradually faded behind them. The wooden stands and the wide green field slowly disappeared from view while the road led them back toward the familiar outline of the camp in the distance. For several minutes, the soldiers remained quiet, each of them thinking about the strange afternoon they had just experienced. None of them had expected to spend part of their captivity watching a sporting event surrounded by civilians. When they first arrived at the field, the entire scene had seemed confusing and almost absurd. The cheering crowds, the strange equipment, and the unfamiliar rules of the game had created a spectacle that made little sense to men who had never encountered baseball before. Yet as the hours passed, the prisoners had begun to see something beyond the game itself. They had seen families sitting together in the stands, children watching the players with excitement, and entire groups of neighbors sharing an afternoon built around a simple contest played on a grassy field. The atmosphere had been relaxed, almost festive, in a way that contrasted sharply with the tension that had defined much of the world during the war. For the prisoners, the experience revealed something unexpected about the country where they were being held. The Americans around them had gathered not for military drills or official announcements, but simply to watch a game they enjoyed. The cheers of the crowd had nothing to do with battles or victories in war. They were reactions to a sport that had become part of everyday life. When the truck finally reached the gates of the camp and the prisoners stepped down once again onto the familiar ground inside the fences, the routine of captivity quickly resumed. Guards directed them back toward the barracks while the evening roll call approached. But the memory of the afternoon remained with them, because for a few hours, the prisoners had been given a glimpse of a world that felt completely different from the battlefields they had left behind. A world where hundreds of people could gather together simply to cheer for a game played with a ball and a bat. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.